So welcome to another episode of the XMan podcast. It has been over 6 months since the last episode of the show, and yeah, I've been meaning to actually do this episode probably since December of 2024. I was always like, okay, I'm going to put the show on a little break, and I should explain to the audience what my plans are and what I was really thinking about. And it kind of just never felt right. There was a lot going on in my life. I was just, the end of 2024, it was just Bad Wolves touring, God forbid stuff with this podcast. And I was kind of, by the time the new year hit, I was done. So it just, I guess you can call it procrastination, what have you, but it was just, I wasn't ready to kind of do this. But anyway, I felt that I owed you guys an explanation as to why the show has been on hiatus. And let's go through that. I guess the biggest reason why I wanted to put the show on break was that essentially over the last couple years, really, I've been so busy with projects and band stuff, whether it was like filling in for Ice Nine Kills or being a lot more involved behind the scenes with Bad Wolves, the God forbid stuff, even though it wasn't a lot of shows, it was a lot of work on my end. I also noticed that when I have time in between tours, I would really be grinding on the podcast to basically get enough episodes so when I went away, I would have material to release. And through all that processes, I realized I wasn't writing music on my own, at least not very much, and not in a real dedicated way. So a big part of kind of like how I was going to approach 2024 was like, I think I need to make some changes. And I need to kind of just declutter my life, scale things back. And this show, I think, was a big part of that. As much as I love doing the show and as valuable as I think the show was, I just wasn't feeling like I was excelling at the thing that I'm really supposed to be most known for. And I kind of have this theory. It's like they say, those who can't do, teach. And I think the new version of that is those who can't do, podcast. And I think there's a real inverse relationship between your kind of main creative output or the thing you're supposed to excel at, and then you get into this world of podcasting and multimedia, and you're really involved with talking about doing the thing that you're supposedly a professional at or great at more than doing the thing. And so I felt like I had to take this out of the way. And by the way, like right now, if you probably know I've left Bad Wolves a couple months back. So I don't have like a regular gig. And the podcast, didn't make, $1 million or anything like that, but it did make some money. So it is a real sacrifice to kind of put it on pause, but I want to write music. And so I actually spent, a good amount of the first part of this year working on tunes. And now I'm kind of getting back to that, but that's the main reason. Well, that's reason number one. And then kind of pivot off that. The second reason I decided to take a break from the podcast was I was just flat out burned out. I mean, I talked a little bit about it before, but between all the touring with Bad Wolves and I'd done the Ice Nine Kills thing, and I was always doing I'm playing with Metal Allegiance, or I'm doing this project. And the podcast along with that just it just wore on me. All the God forbid stuff, even though we do that many shows, a lot of that work kind of falls on me. And it was just about decluttering my life. If you notice, I didn't post a lot on social media in the first few months of the year, and subsequently left Bad Wolves, and it was like I need to just step back from the grind and just feel like I always have to push and be doing something. And and there's a sacrifice, because I do make I don't know how much you think is a significant amount of money, but enough that not doing the show, I would miss it. But I felt like it was worth that sacrifice to kind of prioritize some other things in my life. I would say the third reason I decided to take a break from the show was that the podcast landscape seemed to change quite a bit. And I think the standards for what was considered a good or a high-end show really just went way up. A lot of shows started to integrate a lot more like video content in there, high quality video content, whether it's Chris Garza from Suicide Silence with the Garza Show, and Craig Reynolds with Downbeat podcast, and even shows like Hard Lore, which they're still like a video, remote kind of style how they're doing it, but they were just doing interesting things, kind of like in the field, and even some of their topics and kind of the way they were embedded within like the culture. I just felt like this genre of podcasting in our little world had just, the bar had been raised, and I've been so busy, doing doing bands and doing this and doing that. It's harder to be consistent with the show. And if you have a show that's like coming out every week, the same day, same time, that's how you build an audience, but that's also how you retain an audience. And I started to notice that, the numbers were not really where they once were. And so on like two planes, I was just looking at myself and going, I don't want to do things in a mediocre fashion, be that from a production value or quality of the show, or just be to essentially be playing to a smaller audience and feeling like, okay, this is either plateaued or it's leveled off. And I just don't want to do anything that's mediocre. I'm a very ambitious person. And I feel like if you're not growing, even if it's steady, or if you're maintaining, at least it's at a level that you're like, okay, this is a very respectable level. And I just wasn't happy with that. And I feel like sometimes you have to put a pause on something that you like in order to do something that you love. And a really big point with that as well is I had brought this up, as far as doing more video stuff and uploading the show to YouTube, because I felt like, especially when Garza's show came out and like Rob Flynn's show and Josta as well, they started really putting their stuff on YouTube. And I saw that YouTube had a much better kind of searchable algorithm, and it was easier for people to find your show, whereas my show, mainly being on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, it's not as viral. It's harder to share. It's hard for people who don't already know you to find it. And essentially, Sound Talent, I love them and I appreciate everything they've done, but essentially dissuaded me from doing YouTube, because they're like, well, you don't have a very high-end visual, so it's not going to do well. And I just don't think that's a reason not to do it. And so I basically think I fell behind some of these other shows and taking advantage of that. Things in hindsight are very obvious, because what I was doing back in the day was uploading my shows to SoundCloud, and SoundCloud was kind of a big space for podcasts, and I would do actually pretty well on SoundCloud, and that kind of went away, and I really should have been on YouTube, and that's become kind of just a key place for some of these shows to spread. So I think I kind of missed the boat there, and it just felt too late to kind of catch up. And like the network wanted me to they're like, well, because of the ads and stuff, they wanted me to wait a month before putting out a show. And that's just not how it works in terms of keeping people engaged. They want, a current thing now. And I just think that threw me off, and I screwed that up, and it's kind of hard to play catch up. So the fourth reason I wanted to take a break from the show was essentially that the theme of the show, the XMan, me being the XMan, the guy from who was the XMan of my bands, and going through that experience and interviewing other people who had gone through similar experiences, that theme and that kind of consistent story essentially became less interesting to me through the years. And it has nothing to do with the people I'm talking to, because even recently, I basically do these kind of autobiographical shows, and depending on the person and depending on their story, I would get really into it and it would be very, very gratifying. But some of it just felt repetitive, and on one hand, I also noticed pretty early on in the early years that it seemed like some other shows seemed to kind of borrow my format to some degree. Not that, hey, we're going to talk about your career is anything that unique, but I felt like there were certain angles I was taking with it that seemed to be appealing to some other people. And by the way, I'm not mad about that. I think, that's a compliment kind of to, I think I was really in fertile ground and doing something that was cool. And so, hey, it's cool that kind of was something that intrigued people, but it just didn't feel as unique as when I had started it. And I noticed through the years, I started to be much, much more interested in the episodes where I was talking about things, about topics, and maybe having a back and forth on that, or even debates, right? So the symposium series I would do with Ryan Downey and Mike Mowry and Eric German, where we're like, hey, we're gonna get and do a deep dive on this subject, and that stuff just felt more intellectually stimulating. Or even, like one of my last shows I did with Finn McKenty, and we're talking about the state of rock music and what's going on there. Or, I had Phil Labonte on the show 5 times, 4 of which were ones where we were discussing politics of the day. And that stuff just felt a little more like where I wanted to go, and, I just didn't, to me, repetition is like the death of being creatively fulfilled. You're just doing the same thing. And I needed to do something different. Still haven't figured out what that is, but that's a big thing. I can't, I'm not going to phone anything in, and I'm not going to do it just because I feel like I should do it, or just, even, with all due respect to the listeners, just because I'm trying to give you guys something. My heart's got to be really, really into it. So another reason why I wanted to take a break from the show was, and again, I don't know this one in particular, I don't know how front of mind it was, but it's something that I think has kind of fomented over the years, and that this format of podcasting, I kind of felt like it jumped the shark. And by that I mean, we essentially live in a culture and society where these podcasters are kind of running the world. To some degree, you could say podcasters decided our last president. And I feel like it's become this tool of manipulation and disinformation and propaganda. And you'll see this happen all the time. You guys know I'm a big Twitter X user, and you'll see someone, super famous people will post a clip from Joe Rogan's podcast of someone saying something, and almost by virtue of the fact that they're saying it on that podcast, they take it to be true. And it literally seems like an idea laundering operation that is hurting society. And I really think a lot of these, especially these big time ones, and there's a real cross section, I think, between this and comedians, where they see themselves, I think, like this, like a George Carlin or a Bill Hicks, where they're like, we're the last truth tellers, or we're the last philosophers. And then they're commingling that with their job as a comedian into, well, now I'm going to be an expert on foreign policy or on diseases or medical health. And there's this self-importance around it. Like it you know, because their whole idea is you have to ignore all authorities, right? Like, don't trust the mainstream media, don't watch late night talk show hosts. Everything there is fake and it sucks. But here, this is where the truth is. This is, you know, and it's an environment where essentially, you know, you have like guys like Theo Vaughn, who I think he's hilarious, really charming guy, really likable. But I think he's a useful idiot, right? He just had JD Vance on his show. And JD Vance is a very, very smart guy and a very charismatic guy and a very good communicator. And so if you have all those elements together and a podcast interviewer who's kind of ill-equipped to understand how well the person on the opposite end of that is playing the game, essentially you can get used to launder your ideas and just why? Because you just come off like a regular guy. This is the old, people wanted to vote for George Bush because they wanted to have a beer with him. I think this is almost like the next step of that, of creating the veneer of relatability through these formats. And I think it's really dangerous. And that's sad because I started podcasting because I loved podcasting. I used to listen to every episode of Joe Rogan. I would not be doing this if not for Joe Rogan. And now I think he's one of the most kind of informationally dangerous human beings that has ever lived. That sounds hyperbolic, but I don't think it's far off when comedians and podcast hosts, and remember, there's no barrier for entry to do this. Okay. There's no test. There's no, anyone can do this. Right. And in a way, it's like a society designed by influencers using a format that is there to influence. And then on top of it, for these top guys, it's so extremely lucrative. And we're just talking. It's just something, I don't know, there's something there that does not jibe with me. And so in addition to Joe Rogan, my other major influence is Mark Maron of the WTF podcast. And, in his, my show style and the format is very much derivative of Mark Maron, like a lot of podcasts. Like he's, I think very influential in that. And he just retired his show. Maybe for some of the same reasons I have, but he said something, and this is, I guess, parallel thinking, but he speaks to this problem. He goes, sadly, on some level, we also unleashed a format that can be used for dubious means, propaganda, and pure evil. But hey, it's not the atomic bomb. And I agree with that. And I think it's a real precarious place to be. And once we start thinking we're self-important, like we're the ones that get to run the world because we fucking podcast, is fucking crazy. There's just something really wrong with that. So again, I don't think that's at the forefront of why I wanted to take a break, but it also made me like, hey, like if we're going to be in this space, I have to engage it the right way and really, I guess there is great power in these microphones and these cameras, I don't know. It's pretty wild. So a big question you guys are probably all wondering, is the show coming back? Short answer, I would say not in its original form or schedule. This really was just like a I'm checking in type episode, but I don't want to do what I was doing. I kind of want to leave it open-ended that if I just want to interview someone, I'll do that. But there's no plans for that at the moment. And again, I apologize, because I've gotten many messages, many comments. Is the show coming back? When is an episode coming? Because I really, this calendar year, I want to focus on writing music and working on my craft and seeing that I can still do the thing I am supposedly the reason why anyone gives a shit about me at all is that I'm supposed to be a musician. So let me make sure I can still do that, or at least kick the tires on it. Maybe at the end of it, I'll go, I suck at this, and those who can't do podcast. But to kind of, echo some of the things I said earlier about talking about things and not just to people about their stories. A lot of people would tell me, I would do these monologues on the front end of the show, and sometimes with almost a guilty conscience that like, all these, metalheads, they don't want to hear me talk about politics or my thoughts on this. So a lot of people would say that's my favorite part of the show. And I got to thinking, I've had this thought for a while that maybe that should be its own show where I talk about whatever's going on that I feel is something I want to speak to. And, maybe short bites, keep it under a half hour. I don't know. So I've been kicking around that idea. I have a name for it. And that's probably, if anything I'm going to do soon, it would probably be something like that, because I feel like I could do it quickly. Wouldn't be, it's not like I need to book a guest or do a bunch of scheduling or kind of things like that. I have an idea, let me record it, put it out, and it could be a very no frills, kind of straight to the straight to the point. And things like that, believe it or not, this podcast thing does feel very creative for me, and expressing myself feels creative. And so that's just something I feel like would be a place I want to delve into and see if I can have some success in that realm, kind of just dealing with my thoughts and opinions and ability to communicate. So that's something I'm interested in. We'll see. And as far as doing something kind of musically oriented, I'm just not sure. If I was going to do it, I think I'd have to have a strong visual element, get a studio, or maybe even some kind of hook, doing something. I don't want to re-enter that arena and just do something that already exists or do a different version of the show. It would have to be something that's compelling and interesting and new, because I want it to matter in the space. And I don't really have that idea totally right now. And I'm considering doing some stuff, like I like the idea of doing a show with a partner or a co-host. And I like the idea of talking about things that are topical rather than just what was your life like. So, but I'm not trying to jump on it too quickly, because I do want to focus on these other things. So I'm trying to let me just take my time. And I feel like everything happens when it's supposed to happen, and you just don't force it. And so that's pretty much, that's the whole spiel about why the show's been on hiatus. And thank you everyone for reaching out. Really sorry that I haven't been putting out shows. But I'm going to be around. I'm always going to be doing something in this space, whether it's writing, like I just wrote this article for Metal Hammer about Sleep Token, thinking about maybe doing some more writing, and being, kind of just I really love being involved in the music scene through these avenues, be it podcasting or writing outside of music, because you get to really, I find it to be very communal, in a way of kind of giving back. And, they're like campfire moments, right? It's stuff for us to get around and talk about things and have a discourse. And I still love the scene. I still love so many of the bands, new bands. I've been playing with this band Snot, great band. So I'm doing shows with them and, doing festivals, and still just being in the mix of things is something I find really valuable. And I feel blessed to kind of still feel like I have a role, because, you always worry about kind of being left behind or not, not particularly involved with what's happening now. And so I'm just all about wanting to be involved now and presenting something that's a positive influence on the scene, and for people who love it. There's so much negativity out there. I always want to be about championing things I like, not piling on those that I don't. So stay tuned. More to come. Mama's out.